guys, and welcome to the old hackerspace. We're here in Tucson, Arizona today. We're going to learn how to make the sleeves for your framework. So the first thing you're going to want to understand is, you have your framework all together and ready to go, and you want to look at how your frame moves. Now, if you're working with a 2-pivot system or 1-pivot system, this changes how things are going to move. But something, just to keep in mind is that whenever you have a point or joint that things are moving around, you're going to have different stressors, and then you're also going to need to give it room to bunch. It's going to have to bunch and buckle a little bit to stretch and move, because unfortunately we're not simulating skin, we're just covering it with a piece of fabric. So whenever you have kind of this elbow or a point, if you're putting fabric over a point, like we're going to be putting over the top up here, that's going to have a lot of pressure put on it when it closes down. So you need a nice strong point up, and any point like that that's covered, or if you're covering a joint like a corner like this down at the elbow, what you're going to need to do is to cover the bottom portion, you're going to need to give it a little extra space at the bottom. Because what happens is when you're here, you only have this much space that you need to cover when it's open. But when it's closed, the fabric is not going to cover or go into this corner perfectly. Keep in mind that when it's closed, everything's going to kind of bunch up here at the top, and it's going to move up. Like, it's going to try and stay, like, relative here. It's going to try and stay roughly at that point. So you got to give yourself a couple of inches here, and then this distance here, as you can see, it's only like 2 or 3 inches here. But once it's open up, you've got a solid 8 or 9 inches that it's opened up to. And so that distance also increases. So what you're going to want to do at any open point, so this point is closed off, you need to give it, or it's going to have extra room when it's closed. And then the bottom point, you're not covering this at the bottom like you are at the top, so it's not going to be under that stress. But what will happen is if you create it and you only make it 3 inches long, once you close it up, as you can see, if I keep it at that distance, you have, a good 3 to 5 inches of elbow sticking out at the bottom of your sleeve. So here's what we do. I start with it open, because that's, we're going to account for this bottom elbow by eyeballing it. But basically what you're going to do is you're going to draw the top of your wing, and you're going to, let's see, bolts there and there. And what I want to do is from this point up here to this bottom shoulder bolt is I want to create a swoop. And I don't have a lot of an angle here, it's pretty flat, but all the same, you don't want to have your sleeve have that little angle in there. You want to give it a nice smooth curve. It makes sewing easier, and it makes it look more natural if you have, birds have all that fluff and feather to kind of make it look nice and smooth no matter what they're doing. So don't want to make it angular. And you just trace along the top up here. And then what you're going to do to kind of mimic the shape, those curves that we talked about in the designing and sketching video, same idea. We want to create curves with our sleeve, because we're going to mimic those curves in the way we sew the feathers on and glue the feathers onto the sleeve. We're going to maintain those curves because it looks so much more natural than just drawing straight lines or just trying to cover this up as minimally as possible in block formation or something. So we're going to create these sleeves to kind of mimic nature, and the way we do that is I create a little loop up to this joint, kind of a half oval up to the elbow joint, and then I create another one that comes down and comes down to this point about, I'd say a little more than a foot on this size. The bigger you go, this is a 10-foot wingspan. The bigger the framework, the more space you're going to need to give it. On this one, yeah, from this bottom bolt, I've got a good 10 inches or so, so about 12 inches from that top bolt to where I'm putting the base of my sleeve. And then I'm curling it back up again in this nice curve to come back up to that bottom bolt. So that's my basic, give it a little more there. And what that does, because we only need this, like if we were making this so that it only covered exactly what we needed, this would probably, you know, be skinny to about here and then drop down in this weird triangle. Oh, gross. So we're just going to give it this nice swoopy pattern so that it covers the elbow. When it closes, this will stretch down or, you know, pull down with the rest of it and just barely cover that. The other thing that's going to happen when we do this, you want to make sure, you can test your sleeve too. Once you get everything on and you tie everything on, you can test it and make sure you have enough space. And if you don't, you can glue on a little extra felt. But the other thing to keep in mind is we're going to glue feathers past this point. So even if you have just a little bit sticking out at the bottom, it's okay. You'll have those feathers to kind of mask it. But it is good to have the felt cover all the way to the bottom of that elbow, just because the feathers will have gaps, and especially when they're moving around, you might be able to see the frame underneath. So you want to avoid that. So, since I didn't want to draw on my framework, about, where was it? So about here was my other bolt, and we want the fabric to go over the bolt. We're going to be putting, we're going to actually be attaching the sleeve to our back brace. So we want to give it a little bit of space around the bolts so that we have room. I don't like that one. Give it a little bit of room so that there's fabric that goes around the bolts. So the next thing I do, there's going to be a piece of elastic that goes, you don't want it up at the wrist joint, because remember there's going to be a lot of tension forces, and you definitely want your felt, which is stronger, but or not elastic. We're going to use spandex at the top, and we're going to do about 2 inches of spandex, and I'm going to just do a straight piece, because you're covering, like, while this has a curve and the top is straight, like that top piece will curve between the two and create kind of a boxy top, which is, you know, fine, it'll curl over. You want to have parts and pieces of it, I do in the spandex, to give, for 2 reasons. One, to give it a little bit of stretch. It buckles less when it has a couple of places that can stretch and move a little bit easier. And these are the places that I've found that it's imperative that you have that. Okay, so we have our sleeve. It should look something like this when it's splayed out And so when it's folded over the wing, you'll have something that looks like this. So we have the elastic that goes by the wrist joint, and then we have a strip of elastic right down the middle, all the way up to the hand cover is going to be elastic, or not elastic, I'm sorry, spandex. So this spandex helps to keep everything from binding and buckling. It just gives it a little bit of give so that as the wings move around, the stiff felt doesn't interfere with the movement. So the next thing we need to do is sew on some little elastic strips. The reason we have this is to hold this closed over the wing. So again, this kind of folds over top of the framework and covers it, but it can't just lie on top of it, it'd fall off, right? So we need to put something to clip one side to the other through the feathers that we're going to make. And I tried a bunch of different methods while I was making these and testing these out. You can, if you would like, try and do little buckles or something like that. I find that just tying these in a double knotted bow works really, really well. It doesn't have, like, a buckle is hard and can jam things up a little bit easier. And same with a lot of different types of hardware that you could add. It also adds to how complicated it is in building it. But if you want to try something like that, you can. I just go ahead and I give myself 6 or 7, well, actually almost a foot, I would guess, of elastic, and then I put it at certain points. So let's go ahead and cut some of these off. So what we are going to do is try and create binding points that are not going to interfere with the function of the wing, that aren't going to buckle the sleeve itself in any way, and that are going to keep everything tied down the way we want. Now, there's a couple ways you can go about this, and here's some things to keep in mind. When you go there, you can go underneath right at the frame. At places like the elbow, remember that distance increases as it opens and closes, so you have to be careful that things are very loose if you put them, you know, in certain spots along the framework. The wrist actually is the opposite, that when it's open there's not a lot of space, so it's actually good to tie one tight around the wrist joint, well, not tight, but tighter. And then you know, at the tip of the wing, we want to have something so that it doesn't, as things get bunched up when it closes and pulled on, it doesn't slip away from the tip of your framework. And then you want to have one at the base for the same reason. This is not a case necessarily of the more the merrier. What happens, or tends to happen, is when you tie these two together through the feathers, it's going to be touching and binding on that feather in a spot. So you'll sometimes notice on my wings, you'll see a gap here and there between the feathers. Part of that might be just because that elastic piece is kind of holding the part of the feather up a little bit up near the framework. So you don't want to have this at every single point possible, because then you end up spacing your feathers out at the top and it doesn't look as full and nice. So what I am going to do is I am going to put one at the top, right where it goes over the fold, and I'm going to leave a couple of inches for it to go around the top of the frame, but that's it. And I'm actually going to leave the rest of this pretty open. I'm going to do one in the middle. I'm going to do two around the wrist joint. I'm going to do one a little bit farther down that's going to go and kind of tie around the actuator rather than down at the feathers. And then what we're going to do around the elbow joint is something a little bit different. Everything up here, for the most part, the one here in the middle and then these ones here are going to go over top of your string line that holds your feathers up and strings your feathers together. So these ones here need to be able to go over the frame, but not over your lines. The ones here in the middle at the top need to go over your lines, and the ones here at the base need to go underneath the lines as well. The reason that I do that on this part is it drops a lot lower to cover the base of the framework, and if you tie it anywhere to the framework itself, it has a tendency to either buckle or it has a tendency to not hold, like basically bind the feathers up at the top. Putting them underneath the sleeve underneath the string line seems to keep them from buckling as much. So we're gonna end up doing that. Then I end up always putting one last one down here at the corner. This is where our back brace is, and this is where those bolts are gonna go up here at this top part. And I always make sure to put one last little elastic band to tie at the base so that it holds shut at the back plate, so that you're not getting a big gap there or whatever. So yeah, that's that. So let's go ahead and pin these. Okay, so the next thing that we gotta do is, if you get the goose shoulder that I get, it's gonna come strung like this. And we really don't want to sew on the pre-strung feathers because there's just a lot of them. It's a very dense string of them, and they're very expensive. It's 2 yards is about $55, I think. And so, and if you leave, just having 2 yards is barely going to get you one wing. So what you need to do is cut them up, and then you can extend this out a little bit. It also helps to get the quills off whenever you're working with anything, really. The quills just poke out and don't look as good. And so what we're going to do is kill two birds with one stone there. And we're going to cut the quills off and make them a little softer at the top, basically, and then, make it so that we can spread these out a little bit more and get a little bit more coverage. So to avoid the fuzz apocalypse, what you're going to want to do when you're cutting these, just like when you're cutting fur or whatever, it has a tendency to slough off a bunch of fuzz. And so what I do is I'm going to use a shop vac. I'm going to cut all these off in a big grouping, and then I'm going to use the shop vac to kind of vacuum up at the top, so that I immediately get most of the fuzz cleaned up. That's not to say there won't be additional fuzz that I have to clean up later, but, it helps. Okay, so the next thing that we are going to do is we're going to take our now clean feathers, and we're going to sew them on and arrange them on our sleeves. So I typically start at the tip. It really doesn't matter how you do this. You just want to start at the outer edges and work your way into the center of the sleeve. And what you're going to do, let me adjust this so that you can see what I'm doing. As you're sewing, what you're going to be doing, you're going to be taking these feathers and lining them up like so. And as you go, the way I do it is I go along from the tip here, and then I overhang the feathers. I give them a good 2 inches of overlap with the fabric, but then they should have another couple of inches that come off of the edge of the sleeve. You don't want them all the way up here, because as they move, they're going to reveal the edge of your sleeve, and part of this purpose is to hide it. The other thing too is like having these move around and peek and show the other feathers underneath. Looks nice and realistic. So you're going to do your first layer, and what you're going to do is do 1 stitch towards the base and then another stitch along the top to keep things secure. And you're just going to go all the way along, and I follow the contour of my sleeve. So, you know, as you go along, you're pointing it straight along your sleeve the whole time. And that gives it that nice curve. The other thing you want to keep in mind when you're doing this is this bottom part of the sleeve. We're actually going to be putting some quills at the base. So we don't want this to just look like one big fuzzy thing. We want it to mimic those curves and the proper shape of the top being like a chicken wing. Like, it doesn't have this huge, you know, part at the bottom that bulges down. It's a little more uniform and thin. So we're going to mimic that by, we're going to do the whole top is going to be fuzzies, but then from just about this elastic part over, we're going to actually leave, you know, staying with this curve, we're going to actually leave a loop of it. Actually, I wonder if I have a pencil I can draw it on here so you can see better. I don't want to make this too dark because I don't want it to show up. But so we're kind of cutting out that bottom there. If you can see this line, we're cutting from this end of the elastic, of the spandex, over to kind of the bottom edge of, remember this is where our bolts are going along this straight edge. We're kind of cutting into over here, and we're not doing a straight line, it's still a curved line, but we're cutting short this piece right here with the fuzzies. And the reason we're doing that is we're going to put some quills down. This is a 10-foot set, so I'm only doing 1 layer of quills. If it was 12, 14, or 16, I'd do a second layer. This would be much larger, but because it's so small, we're going to throw fuzzies down here so that it stays looking like it's a you know, part of the meaty part of the wing. And then this is going to help that transition into the main coverts that we have on the articulating part of the wing, and it kind of helps blend the two together, create that illusion that it's all one piece and not just this sleeve that we're throwing over the top. Okay, so one other thing to keep in mind while you're sewing, this is the inside, this is the outside. You're sewing feathers to the outside, but you have all of these elastic ties on the inside. You want to make sure that while you're sewing, you're kind of pulling these out of the way of wherever you're stitching, because you really don't, like, it's a giant pain in the rear when you accidentally sew over your ties, and then you have to cut those, and then you got to flip it over, and you got to sew more feathers down, and yada yada yada. It's very hard to remember to do. It's not actually that hard to do, but I sew over my ties all the time. It's not the end of the world if you do, but it is, you know, just something to try and keep in mind. Like, try and pull these whenever you come to a tie, pull these out of the way so that your stitch can go through clean, and then you can put it back when it's out of the way. Okay, so I'm just gonna kind of give you a once over of what we did. So, and see, this is what I was trying to avoid, is sewing the elastic down. And I missed a spot, so I'm gonna lose a couple of feathers here, and I'll have to redo them. But basically, what you're doing, you can see I have 2 stitches for each row, and what you're doing, you're just fanning out along the edges, and then each layer is being used, I mean, obviously to cover the sleeve itself, but also to cover these stitch marks that you have through the tops of the feathers. So you'll do one layer, and then the next layer, the tips of your feathers should be just past each row of stitch work. Your top layer here to cover this central piece is going to be just little fans of feathers that splay out, and you're going to zigzag across and then put another layer and then zigzag across the top another layer, and then every once in a while you'll have a feather that you kind of stick in there and sew to cover up the tops, and you're going to do that all the way along the bottom. I've run out of washed feathers, so we're going to leave that at that, but you're just going to basically zigzagging. What you want is this fanning pattern to continue through the whole thing, and that fan is going to be central at this line. So you'll have a line of feathers pointing this way, and then they fan to either side. So this layer here is actually going to be pointed a little bit towards the front, and then the last layer points all the way up, if that makes any sense. So the next part is we're going to go ahead and glue some quills down underneath this these layers of feathers so that it hides the tops of the quills, and they just peek out and basically do the same thing as up here, but they're going to create that layer and the illusion that this blends into the coverts of the next layer. The reason we sew this first, the reason you don't like put the quills on and then start sewing over, is because if you hit the quill with your needle on your sewing machine, it will break the needle. It also, even if you just hit some glue, you might just gunk up or break your needle, and we don't want that. So we're leaving where that line is. I left a little extra space. The stitch line is a good inch or two above the line where I want to start the quills to start to be visible. So yeah, and then you just leave that open until you get your quills. There's 2 ways to do your quills on your wings. For smaller sets, it's totally okay to, on the front side, have the quills curl up and forward, like, actually kind of like they're supposed to on a real wing. Have them curl forward, and then on the back side, have them curl down. And this is supposed to be a soft wing, so I'm leaving the quills rounded, and I'm going to have them facing downward. I also do want them looking kind of fluffy, so I am going to curl them up. If you have larger wings, what's going to end up happening is you're going to have several layers of feathers to mimic the coverts on your primary feathers, and those are not going to look good if they're turned up, because it'll be very obvious that there are several layers of feathers, and you want it to look like fuzzy, like a second layer of feathers that's one continuous layer, not multiple. So anything 12 or larger, I tend to always do face down. What's going to end up happening then is you'll have the opposite, you'll have right and left feathers on each sleeve. I'm only doing, I'm going to be doing them facing up, so that's not a problem, but it's something to keep in mind if you're going to be facing everything, downward on your feathers, because you have large feathers, then you're going to want to make sure that on your sleeves you face them downward. For this small guy, I'm going to face him up. Before you start working, make sure that you cut off all of the little spiked quills at the bottom, because what happens, if you have these quills and you're going to glue them underneath, this one's a little long for that spot. There. It's going to be glued down and there's nothing at the end. If you do that with these quills, they're going to stick, the quill piece sticks through and it doesn't look good. The same goes for even these little guys. And what happens, then that's why I went along and kind of trimmed off any long ends that there were before doing each layer. And you're going to want to make sure that you're not having like big long quills at the end sticking through your layers, because it points out that these are not actual real wings. Not that anybody's going to believe that they are, but the closer we can get, the better, right? So, first we're going to clip off all of these guys. Okay, so that's how you make the sleeve. First thing is first, you make your pattern based on your framework. Then you're going to go ahead and cut out felt at the top, a little bit of elastic in the middle, and at the wrist joint, you're going to sew in your elastic ties, and then you're going to go back in and sew on your feathers in your fanning pattern with the goose shouldered first. And sorry about not getting the middle quite finished. I'll get you guys a picture. And then, last but not least, gluing on this layer of turkey quills at the base to blend into your wing. And just remember, you're going to want to, you're trying to mask this, harsh edge of your sleeve, so you're going to want to go ahead and overlap by a few inches. With the quills I go a little bit more, and then with the fluffies I go a couple of inches over top, so that when when these move about, it's not going to show the felt underneath. So that is the basics of how to make a sleeve. Obviously, I'm forgetting things, I'm sure. So if you have questions, please let me know, and we can discuss them on Patreon. Love you guys. Bye.